fantasy short stories. An Interlude of Intrigue, A Tale of Three Kings by Lesley Herron. Chapter 11, Crescendo. Of course I had no understanding of what that witch had done to me. There was no time for her to explain these new powers, and as I wasn't blessed with an ancient tome or dusty book, I had no idea what to expect. But judging by the reaction of the other life wardens, I had been bestowed with something dark, something dangerous. A million questions flooded my brain, but I had no way to secure any answers. The Wicked Witches had made it plain they would kill me if caught. So, with no other options, I ran. Only a day before, I was unable to walk on my own. But now, I found my energy to be boundless. I stayed ahead of the life wardens and their undulating pets with ease, despite their efforts to twist the swamps into a maze to trap me. But surely my sudden boost in stamina was not why they hunted me, not what they feared I had been given. It was on the third day that I crashed out onto the black sandy shores of the beach that they finally left me to my own devices. I waited, watching over my shoulder as I ran, but they never moved beyond their domain, apparently too afraid or simply unwilling to do so. At last, I was free. Not just from the witches, but also the pain that had plagued me for months. I could think clearly as I sucked in a deep breath of salty sea air and set my sights in the direction of Fort Ironhill. It would be a long trek on foot, but it would give me time to discover my newly promised power. The signs of the Brotherhood's passing were everywhere, even along the backwater paths and unfamiliar trails that I used to avoid a premature encounter. Farms were burned to the ground, villages abandoned or pillaged, and the faithful dragged from their places of worship and slaughtered, left to rot in the sun. My heart had grown dark and heavy by the time I spied Fort Ironhill in the distance. My worst fears had come to pass. I was the last hope for my people, and yet I still had no inkling of how to wield my new gift, or even what it was. Not for lack of trying. After weeks of experimenting on my own, I seemed incapable of conjuring even the smallest spark of arcane power. As I crossed the field towards my last stand, a sadness overtook me. The ground was still littered with the broken weapons and discarded shields of my people. I could smell rather than see what had become of my army. Mass graves had been dug and filled to the brim with the bodies of the Fae, dishonored with only a smattering of dirt to cover them. My sadness gave way to rage as I set my sights on the newly erected fort. Perhaps my abilities would manifest if I forced myself into a confrontation. I knew the risk I was taking was a calculated one, but as soldiers began to spill out towards me, I realized I was bad at math. Clang, clang, clang. The rhythmic hammering of the town's new blacksmith struck the cold air, setting the heartbeat of the early morning hustle and bustle. His breath turned to fog with every swing, but his body dripped with sweat as he moved through his daily routine of crafting and repairing the weapons and armor for the Brotherhood, as well as the daily odds and ends required of a burgeoning community. In the short time since their arrival, the meager, charred remains of the once proud Fae fort had been cleared to make room for what would soon be a glorious stronghold for the pilgrims from the west. In memory of the brothers and sisters lost in the battle, the area had been renamed Ember Run, a fitting title to remind those monstrosities of what was in store for them: conversion to the true faith, or the flames of damnation. The city would soon shine as a mighty testament to the glory and might of the scholar, but there was much work to be done. For now, it was little more than a wooden fort full of hopes and dreams. The blacksmith looked up to see his child standing in the doorway, watching the people outside move about their day. "Son, bring me more firewood. Gotta keep these fires hot." The young boy jolted in surprise, but grinned at the opportunity to help. "Yes, father." The man chuckled as the lad disappeared around the corner. Many families had moved from their homes to join the war effort, settling into tents or bunking with the soldiers in the main tower and tiny barracks. Here, craftsmen were in particular demand. This new land would be their salvation. He had brought his wife and 3 children in the hopes of riches and renown. His eldest, Alistair, was only 6 years of age, but already eager to learn the craft. The boy stumbled back inside the small shop, his arms empty. "Father, there are people gathering near the gate." Simple folk have simple minds and congregate around gossip like moths to the flame." The blacksmith looked up with a grunt. "Now where is my wood?" "But what if it's something important?" Alistair looked back to the door at his father, practically bouncing on the balls of his feet. "Do you think it's the scholar?" The man set down his hammer. "I know you're curious, but if Father Drevin deems something important, he will tell us." He gave a slight shake of his head. "And the scholar would not stoop so low as to visit us here. He would wait until the capital of Ember was ours. What was the first thing I taught you about my trade?" The boy stilled his excitement under the rebuke. "A strong fire makes strong steel." "And strong steel makes a strong nation. Now, if you ever wish to see the scholar visit us in these pagan lands, go and do what I have asked." With a slow nod, Alistair shuffled his way back outside, moving to the woodpile that sat behind the shop. He studied it for a moment before he began picking through the stack for pieces that were small enough to carry, shuddering as several spiders fled from his choosing. He stopped as the clamoring of voices grew closer. Angry jeers and shouts boomed out, louder and louder, as the gates creaked open on the other side of the fort. He looked down at the small pile of wood in his hands, and then back up. The priests had told them knowledge is power, so how could his curiosity be a bad thing? What if it was invading forces, a fire, or something else he should know about to warn his father? Alistair looked over in the direction of the noise and then back down to the woodpile. If he hurried, he could investigate and return before the blacksmith even knew he was gone. That was all the convincing Alistair needed. He dropped his handful of logs and ran towards the crowd that marched in unison through the small village. He pushed and weaved his way past people's legs until he broke through and could see what the fuss was all about. Someone was being led through the town by a rope around their neck. An elf. He recognized the face of this man from the coins his father melted down. The Fey King. He frowned as some of the townspeople began to pelt the heathen ruler with stones, rotten vegetables, or worse. But the filth did little to hide the blood. A large gash had opened up above his brow and was bleeding freely down his face. Caught up in the excitement and emotions of the crowd, Alistair scanned the ground near him for something to throw when he felt a hand touch his shoulder. Dread filled him, as he was sure his father had come for him. He spun. Instead of the blacksmith, he looked up to see the warrior monk, Father Drevin, resplendent as always in his black and bronze garb. The general pushed his way through the crowd with little effort to stop before the grim procession.
King Elias, what a surprise! I was not aware you had survived.
There was an air of lofty amusement on his words. The mob pulled to a stop at his presence, and the soldier holding the lead forced the elf to his knees. Father Drevin offered an annoyed scowl as he looked down upon the revered ruler of the Fey folk, as though he were merely a thieving peasant. He reached out and grabbed the creature by its chin, yanking it upwards to face him.
Though why you would return, I cannot fathom.
He scanned through the crowds to see a lack of Fey presence in his camp. His annoyance faded to curiosity.
And alone. Have you come to beg the scholar for forgiveness and repent your heathen ways?
Blinking away the blood in his vision, Elias sucked in a wheezing gasp and managed to gather enough energy to spit at the monk that held him.
Ah.
Drevin relinquished the creature to wipe his face with the hem of his robe sleeve.
Your kind are more primal in mind than I previously thought. Even a dog knows not to return to the one who kicked it.
Elias's fingers pried against the rope tied too tight around his neck, to no avail. It was useless. Whisper had told him no army would stand before him, but he was the one on his knees in the mud. If only he could understand what she had done to him. He returned his attention to the monk before him, matching his seething scowl with one of his own. He threw out a hand, and Elias willed fire to erupt from his palm, or lightning to descend from the sky. Anything.
This is my fort, and this is my country.
He felt the heavily armored boot of a soldier connect with the back of his head, and he was sent to all fours at the priest's feet. He howled his frustration as he punched the earth, willing it with every fiber of his being to split open and swallow these humans.
Leave now. Leave before I raze this place to the ground.
There was a moment of silence before Drevin couldn't suppress a jeering chuckle, opening the townsfolk up into a raucous laughter. He dragged a hand down his face, unable to wipe away the smile that had cut across his lips. He raised a hand, reining in the crowd so that he could deliver his verdict.
The scholar is merciful, but for one such as this, there is no place among his flock.
As the people of Ember Run cheered, Drevin knelt down to the Fey King's level and spoke low against his ear.
Perhaps it is better this way. You won't have to witness what we do to the rest of your kin.
That smile widened.
Or your wife.
As he stood, he threw his hands up in an aimless gesture.
To the hanging tree!
Elias's bravado melted into a cold dread as he was hauled to his feet. His mind was a scattered mess of panic as he struggled to call upon whatever force was now inside of him. The rope around his neck yanked him forward, and he stumbled, nearly colliding with a small boy who had come to gawk. Their eyes met, and in that moment he knew, right now, that child had more power than he did. Had the witch lied to him? The mob closed in around him, dragging and kicking him towards the back of the fort. Every time he made to focus, someone yanked on the lead around his neck, and he choked, or he felt the sharp pain of someone's boot on his spine. At last, they came to a stop outside the walls, and Elias looked up to see the thick trunk of a centuries-old tree. His eyes scaled the ancient oak to see it stretched up into the sky some 50 feet.
Long, gnarled branches curled out from the trunk in random directions, laden heavily with autumn leaves. One branch, thicker than the rest, arched out and down before shooting back up into the sky, creating a natural gallows where two other lifeless bodies already swung lazily on the breeze. Prisoners of war, now too rotted and crow-picked to even tell what race they had once been. Helpless and numb, he watched as his tether was tossed over this branch. Drevin found the Holy Spirit was lifting his mood, and he couldn't remove the smile from his face.
It's not often that a humble priest of the Brotherhood gets the honor of executing a king, let alone the same king twice in his lifetime.
He took the lead from the soldiers and yanked back on the rope, forcing the elf beneath the branch against his will.
This glorious tree has seen the end of hundreds of your kind, those who foolishly march on Ember Run, much as you just have.
Elias struggled as the rope hauled him to the tips of his toes. He stared out into the crowd, locking eyes with the child once more.
O enlightened one, may these benighted fools quake in fear at your feet, as I have.
The rope pulled tighter, lifting Elias just off the ground, the tips of his boots scraping against the dirt. Terror split his mind as he kicked and clawed at the noose.
May they bend beneath your will, as I have.
The rope pulled him even higher, causing Elias to swing wildly into the rotten corpse next to him. Tears leaked into his vision. There was no power, no spell cast by the witch. This was to be his end, and he couldn't keep his thoughts from drifting towards the queen.
And by your mercy, break or be reborn, as I have.
With a yank, Drevin lifted him high enough that all could see this once proud ruler of the heathen creatures squirm and die at the hands of the Brotherhood. Pained tears streamed down his face as Elias looked up. He was nearly high enough now to reach the branch. He threw out a hand. He could touch it if he stretched. His fingers brushed against the rough bark, but he couldn't coax enough from his tired body to gain purchase. Filled with the delight of the divine spirit, Drevin smiled. He had been taught this little trick by the clergy when he was young. A final insult. Salvation, always just out of reach. Let them think that there was a chance their God might save them, right up to the end. It kept them beseeching their false deities, ensuring their eternal damnation. With that smile, he turned back to face his cheering flock, the rope still held tight in his grasp.
Knowledge is power.
There was a thunderous crack from above, and Father Drevin moved just in time as the branch snapped and crashed to the ground. As the Elf King choked down wheezing gasps of air at his feet, he nudged the branch with his boot. It was rotted, withered and brittle as driftwood. He turned to his people with a lazy lift of a brow.
A momentary stay of execution.
One of the townsfolk hoisted a torch. "Burn him!" A cry of agreement sounded as more townsfolk rose their own torches. Drevin shook his head.
Fire is used to cleanse a soul so that it may enter paradise.
With a flourish of a showman, he drew his sword from its scabbard.
Perhaps this is a sign from the scholar. A heathen monarch deserves a public beheading, do they not?
Still blinking away the spots in his vision, Elias felt something tug at his instincts. It told him to get up, to move. Amid the cheers, he could hear the raising of a weapon. He pushed his feet beneath him and with one swift motion thrust himself up to tackle the priest. The ebony-clad figure belted out a bark of laughter as he simply stepped aside, slashing down across the king's back, and sending him crashing into the trunk of the tree.
Corner an animal and they will choose to fight. These Fae are more beast than man.
Laughter broke out around him, but Elias couldn't wrap his mind around anything other than pain. He could feel the searing agony of the gash on his back as he turned around, pressing his body against the trunk of the tree.
Like a rabid fox, you will be put down.
Drevin moved forward, slamming the point of his blade through the center of the king's chest, pinning him to the tree. That grin widened as he leaned in, lowering his voice.
The scholar spares no mercy for such detestable creatures.
Elias coughed something warm and wet onto his chin. He looked down in shock to see blood flowing freely from the mortal wound in his chest. Through the haze, he barely felt the pain as the priest yanked his weapon free. He was helpless to do anything but watch as the crimson-coated edge arced towards his neck and rebounded off his skin. He wasn't dead? He wasn't dead. The sword came down once more, and he felt it impact against him, but something flashed from his body just before it connected, deadening the blow. Something dark. He looked down to see vines, ethereal and black, creep from the gaping wound in his chest and entwine around his body. It felt as if he were being submerged in icy waters, the sensation slowly crawling up towards his head. The gash in his chest began to knit closed, the tendrils of void still spilling around him like armor.
Infernal magics! Thou shalt not suffer a demon to live!
Drevin sunk his boot into Elias's middle, and the entire tree crumpled under the impact, collapsing on them both. As the onlookers screamed in panic, this raven armor protected Elias from the cascade of rotting wood. As it eclipsed the last of him, he understood. The seed within him had sprouted. He looked down at his hands to see, like the rest of his body, they were black, tinged with purple. He had become an entity of pure void. He sloughed off the mighty branches of the ancient oak as if they were nothing more than crumpled husks of straw. He looked over to see soldiers were hauling their leader from beneath the felled tree, his right arm twisted at an odd angle and his face a perfect mask of horror and rage coated in ash and blood. Elias looked to the soldiers, taking a step towards them, and they dropped the monk before fleeing into the fort. He tilted his head, as with little effort, he lifted the broken priest from the ground. This was what the witch had bestowed upon him, but also so much more. Like a song in the back of his mind, the workings of the world were laid bare. He looked down at the figure as it struggled to fend him off with only one hand.
I am merciful, but for one such as you, there is no place among my flock.
His lips twitched at the irony.
Truly, knowledge is power.
Something flowed out of him, and then back in towards his body. The priest, no longer struggling, began to age. His face became sallow, and his skin grew thin and cracked as his soul drained free like wine from a goblet. The decay continued until the light left his eyes and the orbs glossed over a milky white. Elias turned towards the mass of onlookers, many rooted in place with fear, still waiting for their holy leader to rise and smite the devil before them. Perhaps they deserved to have their beloved father returned. He forced the creature's soul back into the ancient flesh.
May these benighted fools quake in fear at my feet.
He flexed his fingers open and dropped the withered husk, but it did not crumple to the earth. It landed on its wilted feet and shakily turned its dead gaze toward what it once considered home and family. Elias moved towards the fear-stricken mob, the very grass at his feet turning to dust in his wake.
For they shall bend beneath my will.
Screams followed the citizens as they fled for the safety of their fort, and a torch was lobbed in his direction, igniting the dead plant life. Elias felt a cruel smile curve his face as he walked among the flames unharmed. Behind him, the two rotted corpses clawed their way up from beneath the smoldering branches, the nooses still hanging from their necks.
And by my mercy, break and be reborn.
Elias's voice boomed out over the cacophony of horrified shrieks, and two glowing lights sparked to life where his eyes had been. He could see this world for what it really was, flawed. He lifted a dark hand and pointed at the fort.
Go forth and fetch more to serve in my army. Slaughter every Brotherhood monk you find, and leave none in your wake.
The eyes of the three horrors flashed purple, and they sprinted with preternatural speed to do his bidding. Elias walked along the very path he had been dragged down not moments before, leaving ash and chaos in his wake. His eyes were set in the direction of the mass graves. With each step he took, he reached out with an ancient knowledge, drawing energy towards himself. Trees, bushes, grass, even the very air around him fed the spiral of death as he consumed it all. He fell to his knees at the first mound, the stench of rot and bloat seeping up through the fresh earth. He had failed them once. Not again.
My friends, I ask that you follow me once more. Let me grant you the chance to save the ones you love from suffering the same fate.
Elias thrust his fingers into the soft soil, releasing the gathered energy in a flood. Once it was spent, he dived into his own reserves, granting them a piece of himself and allowing the shade that clung to his skin to fade.
You shall not have died in vain.
He stood, moving to do the same to the second mound, when he heard a sob from nearby. Elias turned to see a child, the very one that he had shared a moment with before, crouching behind a tree, paralyzed by fear. That nagging instinct in his mind told him to leave no survivors, that there were no innocent among the enemy. But a memory flashed before him, a young Varen sobbing and running to him for help, sad and afraid. They remained, eyes locked on each other, as bodies began to claw their way to the surface. One by one, corpses joined the massacre as the child stared death in the face. It was not long before the simple wooden barrier crumbled in flames, and the cries of the dying rose to a crescendo. The smoke from the fires fought against the morning sun, leaving them in a red haze of ash and dust. The boy never looked away, and Elias decided to leave him to his own fate. He moved to the next mound of earth, the dry grass crumpling beneath his steps. He sunk his fingers into the dirt, repeating the ritual as he pulled in more power from the surroundings. Perhaps the child would have the good sense to flee and never return. And if not, well, maybe it would be for the best that he died here in the fort, surrounded by his family, so that he would be spared having to witness what was about to happen to the rest of his kin. An Interlude of Intrigue, A Tale of Three Kings, is book 3.5 by Lesley Herron, a short novella to set the stage for the upcoming book 4 of the series. If you would like to listen to the first 3 books, please be sure to check the links in the description. And stay tuned every few weeks to hear the latest chapters as they are being written and recorded. We hope you enjoyed the story. I'm Chris Herron, and that's it for today's Tall Tale TV.